This is episode 72 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of the show at the show notes, which are located at www.7, all spelled out, so seven-health.com/72.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio, and this week I'm back just doing a solo show, and this show is me talking about my favorite books and documentaries from the last 12 months. So these aren't necessarily things that have been released in the last 12 months, they're just things that I've either read or watched during this time. And I actually did a similar episode at the end of last year, so if you want to check that out, you can go to the show notes, www.7-health.com/19, and that has all the books that I read and documentaries I watched, and has the show from last year. So this year I've read 25 books and watched 31 documentaries. Undoubtedly, there are more that I've forgotten about, but they're the ones that I've kept a record of, or I could find on my bookshelf, or if I went into my Netflix account or my Amazon Prime account, I was able to locate. And this is a little less reading and documentary viewing than I did in 2015, but I've actually had a lot going on this year, and that's kind of why it's been reduced. And this isn't all just about health and nutrition and disordered eating and that kind of stuff. I really do read and watch a very wide variety of things. And I've actually included the full list of all of the books and all the documentaries that I've watched in the last 12 months in the show notes. So I recommend going there and checking it out and looking for inspiration if you're wanting something to read or watch. And what I'm going to do as part of the show is just run through a short list of my favorites from the books and the documentaries over the last year, and I'll cover a little about why I like them, and then you can decide if this is something that you want to check out. And on the show notes, each book will be linked to the Amazon page for it, and each documentary will be linked to the IMDb page, so you can find them more easily and find out more information about them more easily. And just to say, they are in no specific order. They are just a random list that are being compiled, so you don't need to be just looking towards the top. Just have a look through, and anything that takes your fancy, then I recommend checking it out. So let's start with then my favorite books of 2016. I think I'm going to go through 7 of them. So the first one is called No Period Now What by Nicola Rinaldi. It is my favorite nutrition book of the last year, and it is a completely fantastic resource for people who are suffering with HA, which is hypothalamic amenorrhea, which is a condition to do with reproduction where a woman is not getting their cycle. But it really does just give such a great understanding about reproduction in general. It covers just so many things from so many different angles. So looking at eating and exercise and the mental emotional side of things, and then looking at various options for women if they don't have their periods return naturally, or if they do have their periods return but they can't conceive naturally, and what to do. And I've just found this to be such a valuable resource for me in expanding my own knowledge, but also to be able to refer to or give to other clients to say, look, I really think you should read this, but it's going to give you a tremendous amount of information, because I work with so many women who are suffering with HA. So I highly recommend this. As I said, this is my favorite nutrition book or favorite science or physiology book that I've read in the last year. So definitely check it out. The next book is called Fat by Robert Paul, and Matt Stone has had a real big impact on me as a practitioner. Matt Stone, the health writer, not the guy who does South Park. And I recently saw an article, I don't know when the article was written, I was on his blog, and he'd made a comment that his favorite book on the topic of weight was Fat by Robert Paul, and so because of that I went and instantly bought it, and I've read it, and I really do love it. It's incredibly well written. It reads kind of like a detective novel, despite being about science. It reminds me, there's a book by Gina Colada where she looks at the influenza epidemic and all the research that went into that, and just really well written book. Kind of also reminded me a lot of Michael Pollan's writing, but probably Michael Pollan, if he was being much more in depth about things. It looks a lot at just the theories and science around weight and where we have got to and how we've got to where we've come over the last 100 odd years. It focuses a lot on like leptin and the discovery of leptin and the genetics that went into that. It looks at weight set point theory. I've read a lot of books around this kind of topic, looking at our sort of maybe misunderstanding of weight, and most people thinking it's just about you need to eat more and eat less and do more exercise. And it really isn't that simple. So other books like Health at Every Size by Linda Bacon, or The Obesity Myth by Paul Campos, or Rethinking Thin by Gina Colada as well. And despite the fact that these books are all often covering a fairly similar topic, I really did learn a lot from Fat by Robert Paul, and I did find it a real page turner. It just is really easy to get into, and as I said, it does read like a detective novel. So I would suggest checking it out if you're interested in that at all. The next is a book called Unbearable Lightness by Portia de Rossi. So one of my guests on the podcast this year was Anna Sophie Reinhardt, and she's someone who had suffered with anorexia for many years. It might have been a decade. And during the conversation we had, she mentioned that she found this book really helpful. So after we finished up, I went onto Amazon and ordered it. And yeah, it's a really great, I don't know if great's the right word, but it's a really useful book. Portia de Rossi is an actress. I knew her from Arrested Development. I'd vaguely remembered that she was in Ally McBeal, but I was way too young for Ally McBeal when it was big. I knew that she is married to Ellen DeGeneres, but that was kind of it. I didn't know much about her at all. And the book is just all about her struggles with food and exercise and the obsession that it became in her life, and it really details her decline as part of that, and how she ended up in recovery, and how a big part of that was to do with her sexuality and being gay and not wanting to come out, and how that would be seen in the media and all of that, and just how all of that was then tied up in her thoughts around her body and food, etc. So it kind of shows a bit of a darker side to Hollywood and acting. I think a lot of people have this misguided idea about how amazing it is and how easy a life these people have and all of the money, etc. But it really does show you that it's not all fairy tales. And I'm not for any moment saying that this is how everyone who lives there has their experience be. But yeah, it was just very enlightening in that way. Last year, one of the books that I recommended was Wasted by Maria Hornbacher. And this is by no means as heavy or as dark as that book. I mean, Wasted is probably the definitive guide, or not guide's the wrong word, but really definitive book on anorexia and bulimia and just how bad things can get, and really written in just very amazing prose. And so this is a lot lighter, easier to read in terms of the vocabulary. But it was really good, and I finished it and my girlfriend instantly started reading it, and she really enjoyed it as well. So Unbearable Lightness by Portia de Rossi. The next book that I read is Open by Andre Agassi. So my dad had actually mentioned this book to me in passing a number of times. I don't know how it had come up in conversation, but he'd recommended how enjoyable it was. I then heard Tim Ferriss mention it on his podcast a number of times, and at some point I was like, okay, I should just get this. And so it is all about Andre Agassi's life, and it is just a real insight into what went on. And I mean, to hear from someone who was so successful in the sport of tennis talk about how much he basically just hated tennis and hated every moment of it, and how so much of all that bad boy stuff that he had throughout his career that came across more as someone being very confident and real bravado is actually someone who was incredibly insecure, was worried about the fact that he was losing his hair and the fact that he struggled in certain relationships and relationships with his father. And yeah, it was just very interesting from that perspective. Very interesting from how much tennis beats up the body. And I had no idea about how bad it was. And he just goes into real detail about what a toll his career has taken on his body and how things getting worse and worse as time went on. And I mean, I'm not a huge tennis lover. I'll watch tennis. It's not my most favorite sport. But I read this book in a week or two, and I was sad when it was done. It was a complete page turner. It was very hard to put down. It would be one of those ones where you'd start reading it slightly later at night, and half an hour and a half later, I'm still reading it. And as I said, I'm not really into tennis at all. And again, this was another one that I finished reading, and Ali started reading straight after me, and she definitely couldn't care less about tennis, and she found it absolutely fascinating. So it is one of the best documentaries, one of the best autobiographies that I've ever read. So I would highly recommend checking that out. The next book is Big Magic by Liz Gilbert. So probably about 6, 7, maybe 8 years ago, I watched a TED Talk by Liz Gilbert all about creativity. And the talk, as I said, it was a TED Talk, and I didn't know much about TED Talks back then. And it was when it was still just getting a little bit bigger, and obviously, needless to say, TED has gone on to be something that everyone knows about. But that talk was what I would imagine is the beginnings of Big Magic. Because in that talk, she was talking about how creativity happens and how it is basically so fleeting, and it just happens to you as opposed to something that you actually create yourself. And that was then the premise for Big Magic. And it just focused on the importance of having creativity in our life and why it just makes so much of a difference. And so many people talk about the fact that they are not creative, but how much they are then missing out by not having those in her life or in your life. And it's one of the books that I've recommended to numerous clients, and they've all really enjoyed it. As part of doing the book, Liz also created a podcast show called, I think it's called Magic Lessons. And there's 12 episodes, and with one episode, she'll talk to someone who's trying to write something or do something creative and give some advice, and then she'll talk to someone else who she can then get some further advice to give to that person. And the last episode in the series is a conversation that Liz Gilbert has with Brené Brown, and it's really incredible, and talking about creativity and how it affects people, and how so many people feel that they're not creative, or how many people have been damaged by doing a painting or doing a drawing or doing some writing or some work in school in which they were shamed about it, and then decided that they would never want to be a creative person, or they would never pursue anything creative. And so it's a really incredible podcast episode. I'm a big fan of Brené Brown anyway, but I would definitely recommend checking out Big Magic and then go and download the podcast as well. So the next book is a book called Acid Dreams by Martin A. Lee and Bruce Schlein. And this is completely fascinating book about the history of LSD, looking at the research that was done on it in the, say, 50s and 60s, and then the counterculture movement in the 60s and 70s. And it's written in different sections where it looks at it through the lens of different people. So the first part of the book is largely looking at the CIA and a lot of the work that they did with LSD and a lot of the research they did. And it is just, I mean, if it wasn't true and it was made into a movie, you just wouldn't believe that it was going on. Like, just completely insane things that they would do. I mean, it reads like conspiracy theories, except for the fact that the documents from the government say that this stuff is true. So yeah, really, really fascinating. And there's lots of research today coming out about drugs that are known as, say, party drugs or street drugs, things like LSD or MDMA or ketamine, and how these drugs are now being used in clinical settings and how they can be really helpful in these settings. So there's a great article in the New Yorker. I think it was actually written by Michael Pollan. That was a really long article all about looking at how LSD is now being used in palliative care for people who are cancer patients who are fearing death. And they would give them an LSD trip where it's not that they just give them this thing and they just go home and just do it themselves. They can really create the right environment. So they're lying on a couch, they have something over their eyes so they can't see, they're listening to, I think it's like Philip Glass or that kind of music. And they found that by putting them in that setting and by going through that process, that it can really alleviate that fear of dying. And it was something I also brought up when I was chatting with the guys from On the Back of the Tiger about how LSD has really got quite a bad reputation and how a lot of that is now being overturned. And I would imagine that in the next 5, 10, 15 years, it will come back into being a drug that is used much more in a clinical setting. And so, yeah, the book is really, really interesting, all about basically LSD's history. So it's quite long, it's quite detailed, but if you're looking for something a little bit different, I definitely recommend checking out Acid Dreams. So then the final book that I want to mention is called David and Goliath by Malcolm Gladwell. So this was actually the first book that I read in 2016. So I actually bought it at a market store when I was home in Sydney for Christmas in 2015. And I'm a complete Gladwell fanboy. I've read everything that he has written, and I really did enjoy this book. And what it does is it looks at the supposed advantages that people often have and how they're disadvantages, and how supposed disadvantages can then become advantages. And it looks at lots of different things to demonstrate this point. So things of like how when you start earning too much money, it can be disadvantageous when you look at things like trying to raise children who have a decent work ethic. And it looked at things like having dyslexia or losing a parent or both parents when you were really young, and how this can actually be beneficial despite the fact that none of these people would really wish that upon anyone else. It looks at the civil rights movement and Malcolm X. So yeah, a really, really interesting book. I mean, if you've read any of Malcolm Gladwell's books, you'll get a bit of an idea of what he's like. But yeah, it was great. He also has released a podcast this year called Revisionist History. It was 12 episodes long, and each episode was about 30 or 40 minutes, and it was phenomenal. I was really, really gutted when it ended, and every Thursday I would listen to it like first thing when I go for a walk. And so I highly recommend, like, reading a book's going to take you a little bit of time, but go out and download Revisionist History and just make your way through his podcast, because he is just an excellent storyteller. He's really great with doing the investigation to pull all the pieces together as part of that story. And yeah, it is just my favorite podcast for sure. So that is it on the book fronts. So then on the documentary, so there's 7 of these, and I want to just mention. So the first one is called Going Clear, Scientology and the Prisoner Belief. So this was actually recommended to me after last year's show. So after I did a similar show like this last year, I said at the end, if you have any book or any documentary recommendations, please let me know. And someone got in contact with me and said, you need to check out Going Clear. And so I did. And it is a really, just a great, really detailed documentary all about Scientology. It looks at Ron L. Hubbard's life, how the church was started and how it is got to where it is today. There's lots of interviews with people who were members of the church/cult who have now left and explaining what it was like as part of it. It was based on a book by Lawrence Wright. I haven't read the book, but it's directed by Alex Gibney, who I really love as a director. He did We Steal Secrets, which is an amazing documentary all about WikiLeaks. He did the documentary Enron, The Smartest Guys in the Room, which is also phenomenal. And Taxi to the Dark Side, which I haven't actually seen yet, but is also meant to be. I mean, he wins awards basically for every documentary he does. And so this was another one that's just really well put together, and I'm always interested in why people believe what they believe. And this starts to look a little bit into that. Louis Theroux recently did a documentary all about Scientology as well called My Scientology Documentary, and it wasn't anywhere near as good. I like Louis Theroux, and I think he does some really good stuff. I just felt that documentary was a little bit weaker. He actually had a really good chat on Joe Rogan's podcast. So promoting the documentary, Louis Theroux did a podcast with Joe Rogan. It's like 2 or 3 hours all talking about Scientology. So I recommend checking out the Joe Rogan podcast. I wouldn't recommend checking out the documentary as much. It's fine, but it's not amazing. But Going Clear is, really phenomenal to give you an insight into Scientology and how it all got to be what it is today. Very, very fascinating. The next documentary is called Deep Web, and this is a film that's all about Silk Road and Bitcoin. So Silk Road was a website that was on the dark web. So it was a website where you could buy lots of different things, but mostly for selling illegal drugs. And as part of buying illegal drugs, you'd use a currency called Bitcoin. And this Bitcoin is a technology, so it is untraceable. So rather than using a credit card and then the police or the government are able to trace the IP address or the transactions, by using Bitcoins, it keeps things completely anonymous. So basically Silk Road was the Amazon for buying illegal drugs. And so the documentary was all about how it came to be, how the site was created. It looked a lot at how then it was brought down by the FBI and how the person who created it is in jail. And it talked a lot about the dark web, which is kind of like the whole internet, or this other internet that sits below another internet, and it's often used for selling drugs or for guns or for sharing child pornography, that kind of thing. But it's also then used for journalists and government organizations to transfer sensitive information. And so it's a topic that I find really, really interesting, and it's something I want to read more about when I get a chance. It was a really interesting documentary. Looking at how Silk Road came to be and how it then reached its demise, and just also looking about legalization around drugs and information and money and all that. So really, really fascinating. So I recommend checking it out. So the next documentary is called Beltracchi, The Art of Forgery. I've probably mispronounced the first part. It's someone's name, a guy called Wolfgang Beltracchi, which is Beltracchi. And this is really, really enjoyable. It tells the story, as I said, of Wolfgang Beltracchi. God, I'm butchering his name, who is a German artist and art forger. And what he would do, I mean, he'd been into like painting and art his whole life, really talented guy, and he would go through old famous artists and go back through their catalogue. So he would find artists who had painted a painting or number of paintings that people knew about, but they were missing from collections. So these were pieces that people know or knew had been painted and people had heard of them, but they were missing. So no one knew what they looked like. And what he would do was he would then look at the style of that artist. He'd look at the paintings that they painted beforehand, the paintings that painted afterwards, and then he would just create this fake piece. And then he would release that piece to an auction house. There was a whole convoluted way he would do this and pretend it was the original piece of art, and they would just sell for millions. And it was fascinating the way that he would find the canvases that were then from the original time that art piece was meant to have been made, and then he would wash the paint off the canvas that was originally on there, and he'd get the paints that were for that same period and make sure that they had the same minerals and stuff through them before doing the art. And just absolutely amazing to see how in-depth someone went with this. And the documentary is just an interview with him and his wife and some of his kids, just looking at how he was able to do all of this and get away with it. And he was finally caught, but he'd made something in the vicinity of like 50 million before he was caught. It went on for 15, 20, 25 years. They don't know how many pieces he really made because he's never really admitted to it, or he's admitted to some of them, but not everything or not others. So very, very interesting. And like while the documentary's going on, he's constantly painting, and you can just see how talented he is. And he was able to paint across so many different styles and genres, and to have that level of skill. I mean, I was just absolutely in awe while watching it. So it is a lighter documentary, so not quite so dark or taxing as some of the others. But yeah, if you're looking for something that's an easy watch, I really did enjoy this. So the next is called The Mask You Live In. So this is all about how we as a culture have a very narrow definition of what it means to be a man, what it means to be masculine, and the problem that this then causes for men and boys. And this film was directed by Jennifer Newsom, and her prior documentary was called Misrepresentation, which was all about how women aren't represented in positions of power and how women are portrayed in the media and how damaging this could be. So this was basically the second part to that in some ways, looking at the male side of things after she dealt with the female side of things in the first documentary. And I really enjoyed it. I watched this with Ali, and we chatted a lot about it afterwards, and just the ideas that is so common within our society around that men shouldn't show emotions, or that men are able to show their power through violence or toughness. And I spend so much of my time speaking to women about how messed up the media is in their portrayal of what a woman should be and what a woman should look like and all of that. And this was just so interesting because it was looking at how unrealistic and also how damaging so many of the narratives are that are created for men as well. So I really think this is worth a watch. There's another documentary called Tough Guys, spelt Guise, that was on my list from last year, and this deals with it from a similar, or looks at a similar topic. It was released about 15 years ago, so it's a little dated, but it is amazing how so little has changed in lots of ways. So yeah, that was Tough Guys is worth watching, but I definitely recommend checking out The Mask You Live In. So the next documentary is Dishonest, The Truth About Lies. So this explores like how and why people lie. And that's looking at like tiny little lies to like massive deceits. And it was, I don't know if it was produced or, but it has Dan Ariely, who is a professor of psychology and behavioral economics, and he really narrates the film and then kind of holds the documentary together. And throughout it, he talks about different experiments that he has done and that other people have done that look at when we lie or when we cheat, and looking at what are the factors that make it more or less likely that this is going to happen. And as part of the documentary, it interviews lots of people who have lied, and there's been some real consequences that have caught up with them as part of it. So everything from people who've had affairs with using Ashley Madison, insider trading, someone who was lying about the address that they lived at so their kids could get into a different school, someone who lied about the college or university that they'd studied at to get a job, and this then catches up with them later on. And just really interesting looking at how things make it easier to cheat. And then, I mean, they look at in terms of the financial world and share trading, and how so much of what makes it easier and makes it more likely that people are going to cheat is just happening within the world of finance and trading, and how this is just really a perfect storm. And I know for me, I really love reading about different behavioral experiments and why we do what we do. And as part of the documentary, so much of this is shown, and they run through those different experiments. So I do really recommend checking it out. And it's one that I finished watching the documentary and then started to think about my own behavior and the way that I rationalize things. And that's not to say that I'm dishonest all the time or anything, but it just makes you start to think about your own behavior and the way that the world is. So check that one out. The next documentary is called Audrey and Daisy, and this is probably the most confronting documentary that I watched this year. So in two towns on different sides of America, two teenage girls pass out, they get drunk, and they are at high school parties, and then while they're unconscious or semi-conscious, they're both sexually assaulted. And it then looks at the aftermath of what happens with this, where the girls both endure huge amounts of abuse and cyberbullying and going to the police and everything that happens, and that they both then attempt suicide, and tragically one of them dies. And so over the last year, there's been numerous incidents where high school students or college students have committed rape and been let off with just the most lenient of sentences. And you watch a film like this and the interviews that they do with different people, and you really start to understand why. And the way that so many men are given a free pass, and it's just such tough viewing, and it really fills you with anger and rage. And it also focuses a lot on how the internet and social media has just changed the landscape for kids' lives. And previously you'd be safe at home or outside of school, but this is just not the case, and you can be harassed online, and this can really be just relentless. And I just watched a film called A Girl Like Her, which is looking at like bullying in schools, and this is a film as opposed to a documentary. Very full on, really hard to watch, but definitely worth it, and something that again brought up lots of conversations about what's going on in the world and beliefs and all of that. So I really do recommend watching Audrey and Daisy, but just like be aware it's some pretty tough viewing. So the final documentary that I want to mention is called Valley Uprising. And so this looks at the history of rock climbing in Yosemite National Park, and it looks at, say, 4 or 5, maybe even 6 generations of climbers, and how each of these new breed of climbers have just taken things to more and more of an extreme. So something that in the 1950s took someone 2 or 3 weeks to climb, people are then doing in a matter of hours or within a day, some 50 years later. And I first heard about the documentary when I heard Alex Honnold was interviewed on Tim Ferriss's podcast. So Alex is a rock climber who is best known as a free soloist. So this is where you climb without ropes, and he's featured in the film where he is climbing some of the most extreme rock faces totally without a rope, and it's pretty difficult to watch because you're just so nervous and on the edge of the seat when the film starts to pan out and you see how high he really is, and just on these sheer rock faces with the tiniest little grips, with absolutely no ropes. So really fascinating documentary, very light, easy to watch, good history lesson on rock climbing and Yosemite. But yeah, it was very, very entertaining. So that is it for the documentaries and also for this week's podcast. One request that I have before I go is I'd love to hear what your favorite books or documentaries are for the year. I'm always open to suggestions, and would just love to hear what you've enjoyed. So you can either drop me an email at info@7, so seven-health.com, or you can go to the show notes and you can leave a comment there. And again, the show notes are at www.7-health.com/72. So this is the last show for the year. So whatever you are doing for New Year's, I hope you have fun, and I will catch up with you next week in 2017.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7-health.com.